Alrighty, so today we are looking at organic compounds in the form of like chemistry, right? So we've got a little bit of chemistry to go through today, talking about like which chemicals are affecting the body. Obviously, we know those are going to be our carbohydrates, our proteins, and our fats. And then we'll start getting a little bit into cellular biology after that, just so we can understand how cells operate in general before we start getting into the specifics of the kinetic chain. We want to know a little bit about like what a cell is and how it operates, in addition to understanding it as it looks at a muscle cell specifically, which is special compared with other ones, and then nerve cells specifically, which are special. uh okay, hold on one second. It's fine. All the new folks are like, I'm texting in their group thread. I'm like, don't do that, dude. Nobody likes it when people text on our group thread. Uh, so yeah, so we're looking at chemistry, matter, and life today. This is chapter 2 of your Memler's textbook. So, um, when we're talking about organic compounds, what we mean when we say something is organic, we mean that it's built on the backbone of carbon, right? Carbon is like every element's best friend. They're like the capybara of elements. Like you guys, I don't know if anybody in here watches like fun like animal videos as much as I do. I grew up, my parents owned a pet store, so it was a lot, I love animals and watch it. That's all my Instagram feed. It's just animal videos, but I love capybaras. I would love to have like a pet cap. If you don't know what that is, they're like giant guinea pigs. This is gonna be hilarious. I'm about to let German in. He's gonna be like, "What are we looking at?" But this is like an amazing animal because they're. What's really cool about them is they are literally friends with everyone. Like they are commonly known as like one of the friendliest animals out there, and that's kind of how carbon acts. Actually, carbon is really good at binding to pretty much everything else, right? What's up, German? Good to see you.
Hey, what's up, Brad? Good morning, man. Thank you.
Morning, morning. So like when we say something is organic, what we mean is that like it's part of an organic compound, meaning that like it is found in us, right? So when we look at it, the four, the main thing, most of what we are made up of is water. Like if you look at like this person here, right? You can see that like 65% of them is oxygen, and then 10% of them is hydrogen. What does that mean? Well, if you take two parts of that hydrogen and one part of that, well, that's not true. Well, you take like two parts hydrogen and one part oxygen and put them together, you end up with like H2O. So, about 75% of us is actually water, by volume. And then you can see 18% of us is carbon. And that's a pretty good chunk of carbon there. So, where is that 18% like coming from? Well, you have carbohydrates, which make up a little bit of our body weight because we have stored glycogen in the body. You've got protein. A lot of us is made up of protein. In fact, you see where that 3% nitrogen comes in, you put that with the carbon, that's how you get amino acids, and that's how we get proteins. So a lot of us is made up of protein. And then a good chunk of us is made up of what you can see. We just have this sort of others category, right? Oh, and I forgot about that. And then also you put like carbon along with like oxygen and along with hydrogen, you end up with like fats. So we have a lot of fat on our body, we have a lot of protein on our body, and we have some carbohydrates stored in our body. So it makes up a pretty good amount of our overall like body weight. But this other bit, right? This other sort of like 0.1% and then 4% for these other 9 elements. Those are all of like minerals that are considered actually inorganic. And those are inorganic parts of us that we actually need to function. So like, we actually need to have sulfur in our diet. Luckily, there's plenty of it in water. So we actually get a pretty good amount from there. It's part of us making like stomach acid and part of our immune system. We need chlorine, same thing. You have hydrochloric acid in your stomach acid. Magnesium, which acts like an electrolyte and helps with iron metabolism. We've got fluorine, which is really good for our teeth. We got zinc, which is really good for our immune system. We've got silicon, and I can't remember actually what silicon does, but I think not much. We don't have like an RDA for silicon, but like all of these are going to kind of be little bits found within our body, right? And so we have a lot of different sort of elements, and all of them sort of get assembled to make us up. So this is when we're talking about like nutrition, we're talking about ensuring that we are getting all of these ingredients to make more us in our diet, right? So you can kind of see again oxygen and carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. And other stuff, right? So, when we're talking about organic compounds, the big ones that we're going to spend most of our time talking about are going to be proteins, fats, and carbs, right? Because a compound is where you have several elements coming together. And so if we're looking at an organic compound, what we mean when we say organic is that it's primarily built on the element of carbon. Because carbon is really good at binding to other elements. So if you take a little bit of carbon and you use that as a skeleton, and then you attach a little bit of oxygen to it and a little bit of hydrogen to it, you end up with a molecule called glucose. In fact, it looks like this. Um, Oh my gosh, I can't spell. Glucose. It ends up looking like this. So a little bit of carbon, a little bit of hydrogen, a little bit of oxygen there, right? And so if you put it in this shape, that's a carbohydrate. That's where the word carb comes from, and carbohydrates comes from carbon. And so this is actually really good at being broken down a little bit further into energy, or what we call ATP, right? And so, like, if I rip some of these little pieces away and break it down further and further and further and further and release some of their electrons, I'm releasing all of the chemical energy stored between this bond and this bond and this bond and this bond, this bond and this bond. I always like to remind people a really simple way to kind of remember just like energy in the chemistry realm is like when you break something down, energy is released, right? Think about like taking a stick and you break it in half, right? What happens? You hear a whole bunch of like crack, you hear this like big release of energy in the form of like sound waves, right? Um, that's the same thing that happens whenever you break any chemical bond. Breaking a chemical bond always releases some form of energy. So if we can create like a very specifically high form of energy that we end up breaking and it releases a ton, well, that's going to be a pretty good source of energy for us. And that's what ATP molecules actually are. For those of you who have been through our last mod, we talked a lot about ATP, right? We have this really hard bond. So it'd be like the difference between like, breaking like a wet, soggy stick in half, which like would be like, versus like a really dry, super, and it's like crack, really, really loud. The really loud one that's a lot of energy gets released, that would be like an ATP molecule. And then if you want to get really dark and weird with the analogies, you can think of like that's what an atom bomb is. We figured out how to take an atom and split it in half. We took the smallest thing in the universe and figured out how to cut it in half. And look at what happens. A ton of energy gets released. That's also how like nuclear power plants work. They basically break a molecule of uranium and a whole bunch of energy gets released and it powers our cities. So pretty cool stuff. There. So we do a little version of that 24 hours a day, 365 days a year when we break down carbohydrates. So we break those little chemical bonds. So carbohydrates are going to be shaped in, we're going to see three major categories, right? When we say carbohydrates, that is a category of different types of sugars, right? So they are organic compounds, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But what if I took two little glucose molecules and decided to like stick them together. Like let's say I'll go ahead and take this one right here. Da, 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 da. Copy that. Go over to my paint here. So what would happen if I did this? Right? What if I just linked these two together? It would look a little bit like this. Actually, I would have to take this and pull these out of here, but it would bind itself like this, right? What if I click those two carbohydrates together? All I have to do is dehydrate it a little bit, take a little bit of water out of there, H plus H plus O, and I'm left with a new carbohydrate that looks a little bit different, tastes a little bit sweeter now, and that is a double sugar molecule, right? Rather than two individual single sugar molecules like we see here, right? That's an individual single sugar molecule. Now if I or sugar molecule there, sugar molecule there. Now if I just pull out a little bit of this, I move this over here and I attach the two of them together. Well, now I've got a double sugar molecule. That is what we call a disaccharide. Di for the word meaning two, saccharide from the word meaning sugar. So we've got monosaccharides, mono coming from the word meaning one, saccharide coming from the word meaning sugar. And that's what we see here. These are two individual monosaccharides. But if I, link them together, now I've got one disaccharide. So this molecule is slightly more complex compared to the other molecules, right? That is a little bit more complicated than just two individual sugars. So by me linking those things together, that would be an anabolic reaction, right? That's part of our anabolism. We took something simple and we built it up into something slightly more complex. And what if I did it again? What if I, add another one in there, right? And I pull those away. Yeah, put that there. I need to do that so that I can grab these easily. And then I link this one up and I put it right there. And then like I put another one on there, right? And I link those up, and I just keep sucking the water out of these little molecules here. I end up with a whole bunch of extra leftover H2O afterwards, and that's fine. Put that right there. We'll put one more. Um, uh, oh, that's where I put it. I was like, that's not fitting the way it's supposed to. So there we go, right? That's now I've created this big, long, complicated chain, right? This is what we call a polysaccharide. Poly coming from the word that means many, right? So many sugars, right? So this is a multiple sugar molecule. These are usually what we think of when we think of like plants and stuff. Plants like to store these polysaccharides as part of their bodily structure, right? So they have like stored, energy in them. And so what we do is we consume those carbohydrates and we break it down. And so like as we're sort of metabolizing this, we cleave off individual sugar molecules. So, when you consume like we call a complex carb, some type of like starch, like a potato or rice or beans, or a vegetable or something like that, what we're going to do is we're going to cleave off each of these individual sugar molecules. This is going to be a catabolic reaction, right? Catabolic means we took something that was very complex and we broke it down into something that's very simple. And there we go. Now, by breaking all of that apart, I have 5 individual sugar molecules, and now I can break them down even further to release all of the energy. So then this gets broken down, into chemicals, and it's all used up, and we're left with pretty much just the carbon, actually. Break that one down, and it gets all used up. Whole bunch of energy gets released. Break that one down, break that one down, break that one down, and then I am left with like just a whole bunch of energy, right? And then that energy allows me to power my body to in order to do work and stuff, right? So that is what carbohydrates are. They're a really good source of energy from us, right? So our mono single sugars, generally we're referring to, a good example is glucose. There are a couple other ones out there as well. But generally the big one that we're talking about is glucose. We've also got disaccharides. That's like if you take like lactose, actually. Lactose is also a single sugar molecule. But if you take glucose, sorry, I should just tell you all 3 of the single sugars. So we've got glucose, sucrose, and lactose, right? Those are the 3 single sugar molecules out there. If you take sucrose and you put it together with lactose, you end up with a disaccharide that we call galactose, right? And then if you take glucose plus fructose, you end up with like a really complicated sugar like sucrose, right? So lots of different sugars out there. You don't necessarily have to have them all memorized, but you can see here's sucrose, that's table sugar. There's maltose, that's found in milk, and there's lactose, that's also found in milk, right? So those are our double sugar molecules, right? And they're very sweet tasting because there's 2 sugars linked together, right? That's going to taste very, very sweet. It's part of the reason why like it's so addicting when it comes to foods. I mean, we have a really hard time with sugars in this country. We have a lot of foods that have a lot of high sugar, and it makes sense because like companies are trying to market food to make as much money as possible. And one of the best ways to do that is to load it up with sugar because on a biologic level, your body lets that sugar, like that sugar hits your taste buds, and your body goes, wow, there is a ton of glucose molecules in this food. This is a great source of energy. And that lights up your brain, but it lights up the cave person part of your brain, right? It lights up the part of your brain that says, like, we could end up starving any day, if the crops don't yield or if we can't hunt down our food. So when we get this like big source of like energy right out the gate, our brains kind of light up, and it's why sugar is such an addictive substance, and why so many people struggle with high sugar diets. But the problem is it raises our blood sugar so intensely that our body goes into mass storage mode, and that's one of the ways that we gain body fat, right? And that's not good for us because that starts to cause a lot of different health problems. So those are our mono and disaccharides. Those are what we refer to as like simple sugars, right? Those are the sugars found in fruits and sometimes even vegetables. But mainly those are the sugars found in like sweets, right? Like candies and things like that, stuff you put in your coffee, sodas. And then we've got some disaccharide or some polysaccharides out there. Polysaccharides are the complicated carbohydrates, right? The complex carbs. Like I said, multiple sugar molecules. You can see here, right? This is a really complicated one, right? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Lots and lots and lots of glucose molecules all linked together. So polysaccharides are like starches, right? So plants have a lot of starch in them, right? Let's look at a nutrition label and we can find an example of that, right? Let's look at like bread. Take a look at a bread as a nutrition fact. So this is broken down from like some type of grain, like a wheat, right? And if we look at the nutrition facts, you can see it's got 19 grams of carbohydrates. 4 grams of it is going to be dietary fiber. 4 grams of it's going to be sugar, including 2 grams of additional sugar. Which means what they did is they dumped in a little bit of extra sugar into the bread in addition to like just all of the wheat. So they added 19 gram. Well, no, sorry, 19 minus 4. So they added 15 grams of flour to like a bowl, right? Added a little bit of water. And then it came together as this like sticky dough. But then they added 4 grams of sugar. Part of that is to give the yeast something to eat really quickly, which allows it to build up very fast. But part of it is also the fact that it just tastes better. Again, our brains, cave person brain over here, right? We love sugar. It's an immediate source of energy. So our cave person brain thinks like, look at that, we just got a fuel source like really quickly. This is amazing. So there it is, right? Like, so that's how we have the total grams of carbohydrates. So 4 grams of fiber, we take that out of this. So that leaves us with 15 grams. 4 grams of sugar, we take that out of this. That leaves us with 11 grams. So there's 11 grams of complex carb in this food, right? So 11 grams of a complex carb, 4 grams of fiber, which is a hyper, super duper complex carb. In fact, it's so complicated our body can't break it down. And 4 grams of simple sugars. So 4 grams of it is going to provide very fast, immediate energy. 11 grams, or 11, no, sorry, 19. Yeah, no, 11 grams. 11 grams of it is going to provide us with sustained energy. And then 4 grams of it, the dietary fiber, actually can't get broken down. So looking at fiber, fiber is a complex carb that is in fact so complex. I don't have a picture of it here. It is in fact so complex that our body cannot break it down. But it is a vital part of our diet because it moves through our digestive system. We don't use it for energy production, but it does go through our digestive tract and pulls anything that didn't get fully digested or anything that didn't get fully absorbed out of our body for us. So it kind of cleans out our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract, which is a really important process. And one of the reasons why it's so important for us to get lots of fiber in our diet. Not to mention the fact that it helps us feel full for longer. It makes it easier for us to stick to our diets. So that's sort of a breakdown, right? You can see there's an individual sugar molecule, there's a double sugar molecule, and then look at this big, long, complicated chain here. That's a complex carbohydrate. Now, plants store complex carbohydrates in the form of what we call starches. We also have a form of stored carbohydrates in our body. We like to store it in our liver, and we like to store it within our muscles. And that way, like if we ever end up in a scenario where, for instance, like my girlfriend and I are working out in the morning, and so because that's like it's early morning workouts, um, you don't really have a lot of time to like eat a lot of food like right away. So usually like I'll have like a cup of coffee and maybe a slice of toast or something. Um, Something very simple in the morning, piece of fruit, something like that. And what that does, that's enough energy to kind of get me through the workout. But if I worked out completely fasted, not exercise, I probably lose a little bit of exercise intensity. I wouldn't be able to lift quite as heavy because my energy is going to be a little bit low. I don't have a lot of blood sugar, right? And what'll happen is my body will actually be like, hey, we need carbohydrates. They're an immediate source of energy. So what it'll do is it'll actually release carbohydrates from my liver, and it'll release carbohydrates from like the muscles running throughout my body in order to boost my blood sugar levels back to normal. And that's what glycogen is for. And then the next time I eat carbohydrates, they're probably not going to go and get converted into fat. They're probably actually instead going to get converted into glycogen, which is really nice. Um, that's one of the reasons why people are a really big fan of fasted cardio in the morning. Now, I don't necessarily think you actually have to do that. And that's, you do lose intensity when you exercise on an empty stomach. But if you have like I think fasted cardio is actually sometimes a very effective way to manage your blood sugar levels. I wouldn't do it with a full diabetic because it can be a little dangerous if they end up, crashing in their blood sugar levels. But pre-diabetics, I think it is actually one of my favorite populations to do that with. So that is sort of what we see in carbohydrates. Now, we've also got lipids, right? Now, lipids, what's cool about them, this is what we're talking about when we talk about like fats. And I know that like fats have been villainized. We always say that, fats make you fat, and that's not true at all. But if we look at like fats as a compound, right? So if I had to look at like a lipid here, this is sort of what they look like. We've got sort of three main versions of this, right? We've got individual like fatty acids, right? That's known as like a steroid, or I guess waxes actually fall into that category as well. I never talk about waxes. Uh, but like, yeah, steroids, which are individual little fatty acids all by themselves, not the steroids you're thinking of when you think of the gym. But like cholesterol is a good example of that. Steroid hormones, sex hormones, right? Those are very good examples. There's phospholipids, which is a double fatty acid. So you can see this like chain right here. This is two of those right there. So there's one, there's the other one. They drew it a little different. I'm not sure why, but you can see like this is a phospholipid. And then you've got what you're probably thinking of when you're thinking of fats, the stuff you see on nutrition labels, which are our triglycerides. This is the energy fat, right? So now it's got three little lines at the bottom. So this is either going to be a saturated fat, which you would see on a nutrition label, or a polyunsaturated fat. You'd see that on a nutrition label, monounsaturated fat, or a triglyceride. Or sorry, those are all triglycerides, or a trans fat. And so that's what we see. We look at like, you look at a nutrition facts panel and you're going to see there are four major types of fat there. There we go. You can see here, they actually don't always list all four. But you can see this is 2.5 grams of fat. 1/2 gram is saturated, 0 grams is trans, 1 gram polyunsaturated, 1 gram monounsaturated. So that's 1, 2.5. There's your total fat. But it also has cholesterol listed there, which are actually those steroids. Those are actually little monofats there. So there's actually fat, even more fat listed. But so when we're measuring these out, right? Phospholipids and steroids don't really have any calories because they're too small for us to be able to produce energy. But let's take a look at what they look like. We've got to take a look at sort of like what this looks like in the realm of energy production, right? So if you take a look right here, this is actually what a triglyceride looks like. You'll notice it's got a little bit of carbon, a little bit of hydrogen and oxygen in it, just like our carbohydrate did. In fact, it's got way more. I mean, look at the glucose, right? You can see carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Look at this. Wrong button. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? So we see a big amount of this. And then, we can see a little kink right there. So that's one little kink. That is what we refer to. This would be an example. This is a triglyceride, by the way. See this tail, tail, tail? That's what we're seeing here. Tail, tail, tail. And then this circle here, that's represented by this blue line. So there's the three tails. And you can see this tail's got like a big old kink in it, right? It's got one kink. So that would be a one mono unsaturated fat. Unsaturated means that there's actually, see how there's hydrogen at every seat here? Kind of looks like a banquet table. But there's an empty space here and here. That's unsaturated. This is a very healthy fat for us. This is actually what we refer to as like, this is probably olive oil or canola oil or something like that. Now, if there were multiple kinks, right, in this, if all three of these kinked off, right, that would be what we refer to as a polyunsaturated fat. So unsaturated fats are usually associated with being very, very healthy for us, right? They're liquid fats. So cooking with olive oils or like oily fish, for instance, like fish oil, that kind of stuff has been shown to be very, very healthy for us because it helps with our cell membranes. It helps with energy production. It helps us actually create healthy cholesterols, which helps us clean out bad cholesterols. And it helps with hormone production. So, we got a lot of ingredients coming in from fats. Fats should be a major part of our diet. So as we're looking at it, there are a couple different forms of triglycerides. You've either got the saturated triglycerides, which means it would look like this, but with no kinks at all. So like, let me see if I can just copy this and put it on over into Paint here. And let's say I just like straighten this out. I'm gonna go ahead and delete that and imagine it actually just looked like this instead. You can see there's three straight lines, right? That's a saturated fat. Okay, in fact, here, you know what? I got a way to do this. I can do. Okay. Let's copy this. Don't save it, paste it. There we go. And then let's make it a little smaller. So here is a mono unsaturated fat, right? It's mono because it's got one kink, right? Let's paste that again. Make it a little bit smaller this time so I can make it work. Delete that and copy that and put another little kink there. And this is I'll put another one just for the sake of it. Why not? Put another kink there. This is a polyunsaturated fat. And then, oops, let's say, oh shoot. Let's say we go like this, and we'll just delete the kink off of there again. Like that. That, and paste it. And there, oh, I made it one row too short. And there is our saturated fat. This is typically considered like unhealthy. Okay. We generally consider saturated fats to be a little less healthy than these two over here. So these are probably what you want most of your diet to be. Mostly want your diet to come from these and these. That's probably the healthier options there. So saturated fats are fats that are saturated with hydrogen. You can see, like in this saturated fat here, there's no seats at the table. All the tables are full. They're all saturated, right? So that's usually associated with like this is a little bit harder for us to break down. So these fats sort of build up, and they tend to build up in our blood vessels. That's why saturated fat is associated with heart disease, right? At least in excessive levels. They stack themselves very efficiently, which is also why they tend to be solid fats. You can spot a saturated fat in the grocery store just by simply looking at it. If you look at like saturated versus unsaturated fats, you'll notice that a lot of our saturated examples are things that are usually solid at room temperature. You think of like butter, for instance, right? That's a very saturated, solid fat. You look at like the gristle around like a steak. Um, all of that like solid fat. I mean, some of it's bone and some of it's like tendons and stuff, but the marbling, right? That's solid fat at a room temperature versus like what you're going to see here, nuts, which tend to have like a lot of oil along them, right? Olive oils, peanut oils, canola oils, things like that. That's all unsaturated fat, right? So we get a lot of really healthy unsaturated fats from plant sources. We tend to get a lot of saturated solid fats from animal sources. And that's what we're going to see as like sort of the difference there. If they're solid at room temperature, it's probably saturated. And if it's liquid at room temperature, it's probably unsaturated. So that's a really good source of energy because again, and then you can see here, this is a different way of looking at it. You can see an empty space there. That's unsaturated. There's three empty spaces there. That's polyunsaturated. So there's there's a monoglyceride, a diglyceride, and a triglyceride. So when you think about like consuming these things, again, the same ingredients that are found in carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are also found in fats, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So what do we use it for? We use it to produce energy. We break it down through the process of metabolism, and we release all of the energy from all of those chemical bonds. And look at how many chemical bonds are found in a molecule of fat. There's a whole bunch of bonds here. And that's actually why carbohydrates are going to have about 4 calories in them per gram of consumed carbohydrates, and fats are going to have about 9 calories. There's just more stuff to break down. There's more energy found in fat, which is good, but also like you have to be a little bit careful. If you're on like a diet that's very high in fat, it's very easy to get an excessive amount of calories in your diet because they are so energy dense. And so your body meets its energy needs and then it stores all the rest of it. And that's how we end up gaining fat. And that's where the rumor that fat makes you fat kind of came from. It is a very high calorie type of food, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for us, right? It just happens to be very energy efficient. Does that make sense, everybody? Any questions on carbohydrates or fats so far? Everybody feeling good on that? See a thumbs up. Yeah. All right. Chime in.
Makes sense.
Love it. Chime in if you got questions, guys. So next one we got proteins. Proteins are the ones everybody wants to talk about. These are everybody's favorite, right? So proteins are organic compounds, just like all the other ones were. And they're made of carbon. They got hydrogen. They got oxygen. But what makes them unique is that they have nitrogen. And nitrogen's so cool. It basically gives the molecule this really cool 3-dimensional shape. You'll actually see, different examples of proteins. There are so many different proteins out there. Sorry, chemical structure. Well, I guess that'll work. That's only 3 or a couple 4 examples. But look at how many weird shapes you can get with proteins, right? You can get a big long snake, you can get a little springy action. You can get like 4 of them all linked together in little squiggles, right? Like, proteins are awesome. I mean, look at DNA, right? Um, you look at a strand of DNA, it makes this double helix with all these little links there. That's so freaking cool. That's a protein, right? So proteins are really good at binding themselves into these really cool, really weird shapes, which is why we have so many different types of protein in our body, right? We have collagen. Collagen is like found in our skin, right? We've got muscle. You've got different proteins found in your muscles. Some of them, we're gonna be talking about these in a couple days. Some of them look like this. Those big, thick strand with these little heads on them, and then these little thin strands with little like, empty spaces on them. Those are different proteins. So you can create thousands of proteins very, very easily simply by linking their building blocks together, and their building blocks have different unique shapes thanks to the way that the nitrogen is binding to them. So this is what we call an amino acid. So you'll notice that like amino acids look a little bit different here, right? I'm going to go ahead and paste that, but I just need this. So that's an amino acid right there, right? Now you'll notice, again, we've got carbon, we got oxygen, we got hydrogen, same ingredients found in a carbohydrate, same ingredients found in a molecule of protein. But what makes it unique is this N right here. It's a little bit of nitrogen. Now, this also, you might be wondering what this little R is right here. So there is no element R on the periodic table. This isn't actually an element. This R is sort of a fill in the blank. It's sort of it's like X in algebra. It's meant to represent, it can represent any number. X can, right? Well, this can represent 20 different shapes. So you've got a whole bunch of different amino acids out there, and there's 20 of them, okay? And they've got different shapes on them. And you'll notice there they are, right? So this is going to be pretty hard for me to draw because there's 20 different variations here. You can see this one looks a little bit different than that one, looks a little different than that one, that one, that one, that one. All of them have slightly different shapes. So think of them as like an alphabet, right? So if you were to assemble all those amino acids in this order right here, right? That one and that one and that one and that one, that one, right? You put it in this order right here, right? It's kind of like a work of art, right? You put a little bit of green plus red plus blue plus yellow plus, I guess that's, I don't know, cyan, red, yellow, gray. Put it in that order. You're going to end up with one type of protein, right? But if you put it in a different order, you're going to end up with a different protein. So let's just say that this is a molecule of DNA. Okay, but then let's say that I take this AA and I swap these two right here. That might be a molecule of collagen, which is found in our skin. Let's say I swap this one for this one, right? Well, now suddenly I've got a molecule of actin found in our muscle cells, right? Or myosin found in our muscle cells. Those are two different proteins that look slightly different from one another. So they can form themselves in these different shapes thanks to the 20 different amino acids that are out there. So all amino acids, for the most part, look like this in general, okay? But depending on like what's going on in this letter R, that's going to give each of them like 20 different variations, right? So, I would need to be like, I would need to put 20 of these all together. And if I put all 20 of them together in whatever order, and they're all differently shaped thanks to the different R's, right? Then that gives me a protein. So a protein is a big long chain of amino acids all coming together, and they come together in various different shapes. I mean, we've got 26 letters in the English alphabet, right? And we can make thousands and thousands of words. Well, you've got 20 letters, 20 different amino acids found in proteins. And think about like, we've got muscles, we've got bones, we've got enzymes, we've got hair, we've got nails, we've got DNA, blood. We got all of these different types of protein in our body, and it's all thanks to just putting those amino acids in different orders and ending up with different shapes. One of the most important types of amino acids, or I'm sorry, one of the most, and there's the list of them, by the way, all of the different amino acids found out there. One of the most important types of proteins you're going to find in your body is what's known as an enzyme. An enzyme is an example of a protein, and its job is to actually kick off chemical reactions. So earlier when I was like showing you glucose and we were breaking them off to release all that energy, enzymes are actually going to sort of kick off that process and allow that to happen. So when enzymes bind to different materials, it starts a chemical reaction. You have enzymes in your saliva, for instance, which allow you to break down carbohydrates really, really quickly and fast. One more reason why they taste so good. And they think that some people who, tend to have a really easy time controlling themselves around sugars, they actually think that they might have a little bit less enzyme activity found in their saliva and stuff. And so by having less enzyme activity, they end up being less addicted to carbohydrates because they don't taste sugar quite as sweet as other people do. That's kind of fun fact. There is actually, so there is really interestingly, sugar blockers out there. This is crazy. Sugar blocker taste. There's these little tablets that you can do, or I guess they have like a spray, and basically this blocks your enzyme activity in your saliva and then makes food not taste sweet anymore. So like if you have like sugar cravings, it's kind of an interesting thing. I don't necessarily think this is, I don't know how that stuff works. And part of me wonders if it's like keeping your enzymes from working, which means your digestive system has to work harder later, which means food might not get processed, which means it might not get absorbed. So like, at least that's the conclusion that I draw kind of quickly. So I'm not a huge fan of that idea, but I do think it's kind of cool that we figured out how to do it. So yeah, enzymes are really unique. So they allow us to kind of kick off those metabolic reactions to release all the energy from glucose and fats and things like that. Here's an example of a nucleotide that's also sort of an example of a protein. Nucleotides are also something that we do consume in our diet, but it's not something that we have to concern ourselves with. And we do definitely need it to be part of our diet, but basically we eat little pieces of DNA out there so we can have the ingredients necessary to make our own DNA. And then here you can see there's a little bit of a sugar known as ribose, which looks a little bit different than other sugars. And then this is deoxyribose. And so then if you take a little bit of deoxyribose, which means that we basically pulled the oxygen out of it. So you deoxygenate a little bit of sugar and you attach it to a nucleotide and you end up with deoxyribonucleic acid, AKA DNA. And lucky for us, we don't have to spend too much time talking about DNA. It's a very complicated topic, but that is how our body assembles proteins in order to make new cells and make new growth and tissues and things like that. So we definitely want to have enough ingredients to be able to make DNA. It's one of the reasons why we need to be in what is known as a positive nitrogen balance. We call it a positive nitrogen balance, but you can think of it as a positive protein balance. You need to consume more protein than you are damaging each day. You need to consume enough protein in order to build muscle whenever you're exercising. It's a good way to remember how that works. So that's proteins, fats, and carbs, guys. I got a little recap video to show you. We've actually shown this one in class before. So some of you guys have seen this from last mod, but it's a really good crash course video, really good way to summarize everything. Crash course, proteins, fats, carbs. I gotta remember which one I want to watch. Is it this one? Or is it no? It's not that one. I think it's this one. Yeah. Oh, come on now. Skip. All right. This is the one where he eats the really nasty sandwich. So some of you guys might remember this one from last time, but again, the animation's really, really helpful. Minimize that. Here we go.
Hello, and welcome to the kitchen. I wanted to invite you here today because last week we started off in my bathroom, and I kind of feel bad about that. And also because as I'm making lunch today, I wanted to, sort of use it as a lab. During this time in my kitchen, I'm going to talk to you about 3 different things. 1, the 3 most important molecules on the earth. 2, possibly the grossest sandwich I'm ever going to eat. And 3, an obscure scientist who taught us everything that we know about urine. So far we've talked about carbon and we've talked about water, and now we're going to talk about the molecules that make up every living thing and every living thing in every living thing. I don't care if you're a bacterium, or if you're a blue whale, or if you're Lady Gaga, or if you're a mite living on the Queen of England's eyelashes. They're called biological molecules. These aren't just building blocks. These are the molecules necessary for every living thing on Earth to survive. They are essential sources of energy. They are the means of storing that energy. They are also the instructions that all organisms use to be born, to grow, and ultimately pass those same instructions on to their future generation. They are the ingredients for life. And we call them the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. And today we're just going to be talking about the first 3. It's no coincidence that we classify them in the same way that we classify food, because they're food. And for this classification, we have to thank a little-known English physician who, hundreds of years ago, dedicated his life to the study of human pee.
Oh, my goodness, I'm back in the... That must mean that it's time for the most awkwardly named segment here on Crash Course, the biolography. His name was William Prout, and in the early 1800s he became fascinated with human digestion, especially our urine. And that's because he thought that the best way to understand the human body was through chemistry, and the best way to understand the body's chemistry was to understand what it does to food. By day, he was a practicing physician, but every morning before breakfast he did research in his home laboratory in London. And there he did many great things, like being the first to discover that our stomachs contained hydrochloric acid, and writing a breakthrough book about kidney stones called An Inquiry into the Nature and Treatment of Gravel, Calculus, and Other Diseases Connected with a Deranged Operation of Urinary Organs. And he was, of course, the first person to discover the chemical composition of pure urea, the main component of urine. For the record, here it is, and in the presence of water, urea gives off ammonia, which is why your pee smells. Through his years of studying urine, Prout came to the conclusion that all foodstuffs fell into 3 categories: the saccharinous, carbohydrates, the oleaginous, the fat, and the albuminous, the proteins. He went so far as to say that in order to be healthy, you needed to eat all 3 of these things, not just, sheep kidneys and gin, which is probably what most of London was living on at the time. But like many great minds, Prout was overlooked in his own lifetime because while he was studying actual science, everybody else was walking around believing that the color of your urine was determined by your personality. And this guy looks like a total jerk to me. And if you can tell that much by color, I wonder what you can tell by taste.
Now, he didn't understand that there were biological molecules. He didn't understand what these things were, but he did understand that there were 3 ingredients necessary for life. And it turns out that all organisms either need to synthesize or ingest those ingredients in order to live. We're going to start out with the most basic of these ingredients for life, and that is the carbohydrate. You've no doubt heard of them. You may, in fact, be avoiding them like the plague. But the fact is that nothing and no one can avoid carbohydrates because they are the source of all energy that we have available to us. Carbohydrates are made up of sugars, and the simplest of them are called monosaccharides. Mono for one, saccharides for the actual root of the word sugar. The star of the show here is glucose, because it's truly fundamental, by which I mean like number 1 on the global food chain, because it comes from the sun. All biological energy is originally captured from the sun by plants as glucose through photosynthesis. And every cell that needs energy uses glucose to get that energy through a process called respiration. In addition to glucose, there are other monosaccharides like fructose, which has the same molecular formula, C6H12O6, but arranged differently. These subtle chemical differences do matter. Fructose, for example, is significantly sweeter than glucose. It's also processed by our bodies in different ways. And then there are disaccharides, which, like the name says, are just 2 monosaccharides put together. And the most famous of these is sucrose, which is simply a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule joined by a covalent bond. Mono and disaccharides are pretty much little niblets of energy that are really easy for our bodies to process. But when these carbohydrates start to form into longer and longer chains, their function and their roles change as well. Instead of being sources for instant energy, they become storehouses of energy or structural compounds. These are polysaccharides. Instead of being just 2 or 3 monosaccharides put together, polysaccharides can contain thousands of simple sugar units. And because they're so big and burly, they're great for building with. In plants, cellulose is the most common structural compound. It's just a bunch of glucose molecules bound together, and it is the most common organic compound on the planet. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to digest. Cows can do it, but humans certainly cannot, which is why you don't enjoy eating grass. Polysaccharides are also really good for storing energy, and not just structurally, but just as an energy store. And that's where we get bread. Now, really interesting thing here, bread made up of starch, the most simple of which is called amylose. Amylose and cellulose look almost exactly identical, but one is grass and the other is bread. Like, chemistry! Plants store glucose in the form of starch, and it comes in lots and lots of different forms, from roots and tubers to the sweet flesh of fruits to the starchy seeds of the wheat plant that end up being milled into flour. Ground up grain is the main ingredient in the bread, of course, and most of the calories, or the energy content, comes from carbohydrates. When I eat this, and I'm going to eat the hell out of it, I'm going to be eating all of the chemical energy that this wheat plant got from the sun in order to feed its next generation of seeds that we then stole for our own use. All for me. Now, we as human beings can't grow fruits or tubers, so we have to store our energy in a couple of different ways. The way that we tend to store carbohydrate energy is in glycogen, which is very similar to amylose or starch, but has more branches and is more complicated. It's basically made up of the glucose that we have left over after we eat, and it sits in our muscles really ready to use, and it's also stored in our livers. It's generally a pretty short-term store. If we don't eat for like a day, pretty much all of our glycogen gets depleted. But over the longer term, the way that we store our energy is through fat. All of our mom's worst enemies, the fat, which turn out to be actually really important and are the most familiar sort of a very important biological molecule, the lipid. Lipids are smaller and simpler than complex carbohydrates, and they're grouped together because they share an inability to dissolve in water. This is because their chemical bonds are mostly nonpolar. And since water, as we learned in the previous episode, despises nonpolar molecules, the two do not mix. It's like oil and water. In fact, it's exactly like oil and water. And if you've ever read a nutrition label or seen this thing called the television, you're probably pretty conversant in the way that we classify fats. But then, 99% of us have no idea what those classifications actually mean. Fats are made up mainly of 2 chemical ingredients, glycerol, which is a kind of alcohol, and fatty acids, which are long carbon-hydrogen chains that end in a carboxyl group. When you get 3 fatty acid molecules together and connect them to a glycerol, that's a triglyceride. These feature prominently in things like butter and peanut butter and oils and white parts of meat. These triglycerides can either be saturated or unsaturated, and I know that when we put the word fat and saturated into the same sentence, it sounds like an evening at KFC, but here we're talking about being saturated with hydrogen. As you hopefully remember from our first lesson, carbon is very nimble in how it uses its 4 electrons. It can form single or double or even sometimes triple bonds. This means that if the carbon atoms in a fatty acid are connected to each other with single bonds, all of the carbon atoms end up connected to at least 2 hydrogen atoms, and one of them picks up a third. So the fatty acid is saturated with hydrogen. But when some of the carbon atoms are connected to each other with double bonds, all of those carbon's electrons are spoken for, and so they're not able to pick up those hydrogen atoms. This means that they're not saturated with hydrogen, and they are unsaturated fatty acids. To demonstrate, may I direct your attention to this jar of peanut butter. Here you can kind of see both kinds of fat. The liquid stuff you see at the top here, that is the unsaturated fat, which we generally think of as oils. The pasty stuff down here also contains lots of unsaturated fat, but also contains saturated fat, which doesn't have any double bonds, so it can pack more tightly and form solids at room temperature. And there are also other fat classifications that you've heard of. Trans fats, which everyone tells you never to eat. They're right, don't eat them. They don't exist in nature and are basically unsaturated fatty acids that instead of kinking, go straight across, and so they're extra super bad for you. Don't eat them. Omega-3 fats are fatty acids that are unsaturated at the 3 position, which is like right there. Then that's the only difference. But the reason why these are important is because we can't synthesize them ourselves. They're essential fatty acids, meaning that we need to eat them in order to get them. All this is starting to make me pretty hungry. But before we get to more food stuff, there are some unappetizing sort of lipids that we also need to talk about. So remember that triglycerides are 3 fatty acids connected to a glycerol. Swap one of those fatty acids out for a phosphate group and you have a phospholipid. And these make up cell membrane walls. Since that phosphate group gives that end a polarity, it's attracted to water. And the other end is nonpolar and it avoids water. So if you were to scatter a bunch of phospholipids into some water, they would automatically arrange themselves like this, with the hydrophobic ends facing each other and the hydrophilic ends sticking out to face the water. Every cell in your body uses this natural structure to form its cell wall in order to keep the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. Another class of lipids is the steroids. Steroids have a backbone of 4 interconnected carbon rings, which can be used to form hundreds of variations. The most fundamental of them is cholesterol, which binds with phospholipids to help form cell walls. But these can also be activated to turn into different lipid hormones. And so now we approach the most complicated, powerful, polymorphously awesome chemicals in our body, the protein. And by complicated, I mean that they are probably the most complicated chemical compounds on the planet. In fact, they're so amazing that we're going to do a separate episode on them and how they are created by DNA. But right now, in you, there are tens of thousands of proteins doing everything they can to keep you alive. There are enzymes regulating chemical processes, helping you digest food. There are antibodies connecting themselves to invaders like bacteria and viruses so that your immune system can get them. There are protein endorphins that mess around with your brain and make you feel emotions. They're everywhere. They do everything. And proteins do all of this stuff using just 20 different ingredients, and these are the amino acids. Just like fatty acids, amino acids have a carboxyl group at one end, and on the other end, they have an amino group, amino acid. Now hey, I don't know if you noticed this, but this is the first time that nitrogen has shown up in our food. This is super important because despite the fact that nitrogen is everywhere, it's 80% of the air, we can't just pull it out of the air and put it into our bodies. We have to get nitrogen from food, and so we have to eat foods that are high in protein, like this egg, which by its very virtue, because it is all the white part is protein, it contains a goodly amount of nitrogen. Now in the middle of the amino and the acid group is a carbon, and it shares one of its electrons with good old hydrogen, and the other electron is free to be shared with R, which is just a kind of fill in the blank. We call it the R group. It could also be called a side chain, and there are 20 different kinds of side chains. Whatever fits in that blank will determine the shape and the function of that amino acid. So if you put this in there, you get valine, which is an amino acid that does a lot of stuff like protecting and building muscle tissue. And if you put this in there, you get tryptophan, which may be best known for its role in helping you regulate mood and energy levels. Amino acids form long chains called polypeptides. Proteins are formed when these polypeptides not only connect, but elaborate in, frankly, really elegant structures. They fold, they coil, they twist. If they were sculptures, I would go to the museum every day just to look at them, and I'd walk straight past the nudes without even looking. But protein synthesis is only possible if you have all of the amino acids necessary, and there are 9 of them that we can't make ourselves. Histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. By eating foods that are high in protein, we can digest them down into their base particles and then use these essential amino acids in building up our own proteins. Some foods, especially ones that contain animal protein, have all of the essential amino acids, including this egg. And that concludes this triple-decker sandwich of biological awesomeness, which is all we need to be happy, healthy people. And I'm sure, because of that, it's going to be delicious. Nope. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course. We'll be discussing something else very interesting next week. I don't even know what it is. Don't forget, go back, reinforce what you have learned today by going back and watching bits that you may not feel like you got completely. We'll also, of course, be available on Facebook and Twitter if you would like to ask us questions or give us suggestions there.
All right. So that is sort of a breakdown of biologic molecules, right? All of your cells, everything in your body is made up of all of those 3 things, proteins, fats, and carbs, along with some really interesting stuff found in the form of minerals that are inorganic, that sometimes give us a little bit of structure as well. So for instance, your red blood cells have a molecule of iron at their center, which sort of isn't necessarily part of us. It just kind of floats around. We sort of trap it inside of our red blood cells, but it attracts oxygen molecules. Or zinc, which your cells sort of hold on to in order to make like little projections from themselves. We've got all kinds of like really cool little minerals inside the body that also give us structure. Like our skeletal system is made up of calcium phosphate. It's where you put a little bit of phosphorus and a little bit of calcium together, surround it with some proteins, and there you've got this super hard structure that gives us shape and stuff. So I do want to work our way into understanding cells in general here, but any questions or comments so far, everybody? German, how you feeling?
Feeling good, man. It's just a lot to take in as far as the breakdown of the chemicals.
For sure. So we
that.
do have dedicated nutrition classes that we'll get into in more in depth. You just happened to come in on the tail end of that.
No worries, no worries.
Yeah.
But I get it though. I mean, the theory's there.
Cool. All right, well, let's take a look at cells. Let's see what happens when you take all those compounds and put them together in a weird structure inside our body, right? So we got a lot of different structure inside of our cells. You're generally going to see the same thing in all cells. What's funny is we sort of draw like your generic animal cell, kind of like this. This is sort of representing your classic animal cell. Like, let's see here. We can find an even simpler version if we look at something like that. You know, they're kind of all look exactly the same for the most part. What's funny is not a single cell in your body actually looks like this. This would be kind of a non-functioning cell, because while this diagram is everything that a cell generally has, it doesn't have anything specific. And yesterday, we know that form follows function, right? We know that something's shape is related to how it's going to perform. Because this doesn't have a very specific shape, it wouldn't actually do anything. It would just kind of live as it is. It's sort of almost like an amoeba. Generally, we'll have muscle cells, which look like this, but then they have these big, long rods that run end to end, which allow them to contract and relax. We'll see fat cells, which have a big empty sac around the outside of them to store triglycerides. We've got bone cells, which sort of form themselves into flat little shapes, but they all have nuclei. They all have little mitochondria in them. You know, they're all doing the general stuff. So we're going to kind of go through what those general pieces are that we're going to find in every cell that we've got. So the outside of a cell is going to have what's known as like cilia or flagella. Usually cilia is sort of the most common. That's these little like hair-like projections. You're only going to find these on animal cells, which is kind of funny, because that's actually what allows them to sort of move nutrients around and stuff. So like, you know, let's say you need to get a sugar into the cell and it lands over here, but you know, the sugar door is over here. Well, the cilia can kind of move it from one place to the other. Thank you. Appreciate that. So that's sort of like what the fur is there. And then, like I said, you've got flagella as well. That would be like if you have like one big long tail projecting from the cell, and that's what allows like cells to propel themselves around. So, but one big thing that you're going to see on all of them, you can see this outer layer right here. You can see this like wall that makes out the outer layer of the cell. That is your plasma membrane. Okay. And your plasma membrane actually looks like this. You're actually going to see it's two layers of fats. Remember we talked about phospholipids just a minute ago, right? And so it actually sort of arranges itself like this, where, you know, if you put fat in water, the hydrophilic ends, which like water, they're a big fan of water, face outwards, and the hydrophobic end, which is down here, hates water. It faces itself inwards. And so if you had two layers of that, one layer on top and one layer on bottom, we would call that a bilayer, because while di means two, bi also means two, which is annoying. So this is a phospholipid bilayer, or two layers of phospholipids. And what that does is that is able to keep water from penetrating from the outside in and keep water from escaping from the inside out. And That's how our cells sort of balance out their water levels. Now, obviously, I can't get anything through this. This is a solid wall, so it doesn't actually look like this. Instead, it'll look something more like this, where you can see straddling the wall, kind of like the walls of your house, you've got like doors and windows, and so things can move through those, right? So if I want to get like a sugar in, right, like maybe I got a little molecule of sugar here, well, I can open up this little protein here, and it can straddle the membrane. So you can see there's all different types of proteins mixed in with this layer of all of our cells. So that's what the outside layer looks like. You can see they didn't draw any proteins in here, but there would be proteins that would straddle the membrane of the wall to allow certain materials in and certain materials out. Now in the center, you've got what's known as your nucleus. That's this big yellow organelle right here. And that's sort of like the brain of your cell. This contains all your DNA. And your DNA is your blueprint for how to grow your cell and how for your cell to function. And so, what happens is it basically spits out little commands, and then those commands sort of show up and tell the rest of the body, or sorry, the rest of the cell, like what to do, right? So your nucleus is often the largest organelle, and it contains DNA, and that DNA tells your cell how to grow and how to function and how to do all of its stuff. Now, there's other ones in here. You can see like this is what we call your endoplasmic reticulum. You've got your Golgi apparatus right here. You've got more endoplasmic reticulum. This is the rough stuff. This is the smooth stuff. Little lysosomes there, centrioles, which give the cell its like framework that gives it structure. But probably one of the biggest things that's most important is actually this empty space in between all of these little floating things, right? There's a lot of empty space in here. Well, it's not actually empty. It's actually filled with water. It's this very wet, swampy environment. And that water is known as your cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the fluid portion of our cell. The fluid is called cytosol. And then all these little things that are suspended in it, the nucleus and the centrioles and the Golgi apparatus and all that stuff, those are known as organelles. Your organelles are little special structures that do stuff, right? Your nucleus is the largest organelle. The ribosomes assemble the proteins. They're little tiny organelles, probably the smallest. But they're suspended in that cytosol. And so when you put stuff in a fluid, we call it a plasma, right? So that's why we call it cytoplasm. And probably the most important organelle, well, the most important organelle is probably the DNA. But one of the most important organelles for energy production is your mitochondria. So these they kind of look like potato bugs, if you ask me. Like this is a really stretched out potato bug. But you can see these little pink things right here, right? Those are what we call your mitochondria. And your mitochondria are the organelles that actually take in glucose and spit out energy. So our mitochondria are where and they take in a little bit of oxygen as well. And that's why we need to have carbohydrates in our diet and why we need to breathe, because like that allows oxygen and glucose to go in and spit out massive amounts of energy. And that powers our cell in order for our cell to be able to do work. And it powers everything in our body. Every cell that you've got needs to have mitochondria in it in order to produce energy. So like I said, this is a very generic sort of basic cell here, but generally cells are going to be shaped in very special ways in order to give them different functions, right? So the plasma membrane, like I said, that's the outermost layer of the cell that contains everything. It's a phospholipid bilayer. And then there are little like proteins that straddle it. Some of them are channels, which basically is just a sort of an open door. There's transporters, which can grab something and shuttle it from one place to the other. There's receptors, which are on the outside of the cell that when stuff binds to that, it causes the cell to do something. Your taste buds are a good example of that. There's enzymes that live on the outside of the membrane in order to kick off chemical reactions. There's linkers, which allow you to attach one cell to another. And there's even cell identity markers. There's little name tags on your cells. And that way your immune system will come by and be like, who are you? Are you a Marvin cell? Okay, I'll keep you around. Like rather than like being like, who are you? Like, you don't belong here. And then they eat it. That's how your immune system eats viruses and things like that. They don't have your name tag. So there's the little channels and the proteins that are going to kind of straddle that membrane there. Now, your plasma membrane is really cool because it is able to let certain materials in and certain materials out. It is what we call selectively permeable, right? So if something is permeable, it means that it can move from one side of a place to another, right? Like something can permeate it from one side to the other. It can move from A to B, right? So your cells are what we call selectively permeable, and they can let certain things in and certain things out. So for instance, you have different concentrations of like sodium and potassium on different sides of your cell. So potassium is this little K right here, and sodium is this little Na right here. And you'll notice that there's more sodium on this side and there's more potassium on this side. So that makes the inside of the cell's membrane negative and the outside of the cell's membrane positive. Now, if you got a protein that actually straddle these membranes, right? Let's go ahead and use this to say that those are channels there, right? What you can do is you can selectively move stuff from one place to the other. If I took this this sodium and I rushed it inside the cell, let's say I take all this sodium, travel it through the proteins, and I move this concentration from one side of the membrane to the other, right? And I move this all over here. Well, now what's going to happen is potassium is going to try to rush out on the other side to kind of balance things out. But what ends up happening is now you've actually switched the concentration of positive and negative stuff. So now this is no longer positive on this side. It's actually negative. And this is no longer positive on this side. Oh, that's what I already said. Sorry, it's no longer positive on this side. It's positive on the inside, right? And it's no longer negative on the inside. It's negative on the outside. So we've actually switched the concentration of this. Now, if you were to do this down like a line, right? So let's say this line represents the cell, and we had a whole bunch of positive stuff over here. We had a whole bunch of negative stuff over here, but then I switched the concentration. Now I've got negative over here and I've got positive over here, and then it kind of goes back to normal, right? Well, what that's going to do is when you are trying to move these electrons, the electrons are trying to move from this side to this side and from this side to this side. And so when those electrons start moving back and forth like that, that is what we refer to as like electricity, right? When you're talking about like a battery, right? You've got two little batteries, and you put them in your remote. What am I doing? I can just do this. Let's say you got two little batteries here, right? And you always place them like this, right? You put them facing opposite ends. You've got the positive side over here and here, and you've got the negative side over here. And what that does is electricity is going to move from this side to this side, and then it's going to be like, well, I'm not happy there actually, and so it's going to move. It's just going to keep moving electrons back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and then all this energy gets released, all this electricity gets released. And so what'll happen is we capture that electricity and we use it to power our electronic devices. That's how batteries work, right? Well, your cells are able to do this, right? If they move that concentration back and forth like this, there's our original concentration there, right? But then I just start moving it like this. That makes everything, it switches the polarity. It makes it positive on the inside and negative on the outside. So if we do that from here to here to here to here to here to here to here, that's actually how your neurons in your brain create electrochemical signals. And it gets information from your brain down to your foot, which is really far away. And it just moves sort of like this, right? It moves this concentration. So let's say, you've got a whole bunch of positive stuff. And a whole bunch of negative stuff. And you just switch it. Like you switch this one, and then you undo it, and you switch this one, and you undo it, and you switch this one, and then you undo it. that one, and undo it, and it travels in that direction. And eventually it'll end up wherever it happens to be going. That's how we use this. So we need all of our cells to be selectively permeable, right? We need to allow certain materials to travel from one place to another. And when that happens, when stuff travels from one place to another, we call that diffusion. We'll talk about that more in just a second. So there's our phospholipid bilayer and how it functions. We've got the nucleus, which, like I said, has all of our DNA and our chromosomes and stuff. That's how we get all of our information that tells our body how to grow. We've got the cytoplasm, which is that fluid within the cell and allows materials to move around very easily. And then all kinds of other little ones as well that we don't really need to, we don't have to spend too much time like looking at these, but you got vesicles, which are like little sacs that store stuff. You got ribosomes, which assemble the DNA. They live on the endoplasmic reticulum, but don't worry about those too much. You've got the projections, like I said, you got cilia. That's like hair-like projections around the outside that can move materials around the cell. You got flagella, which allow the cell to propel itself, kind of like a torpedo from one place to another. And so there's all kinds of different cells throughout your body. You got neurons, which have long tails that allow them to send that electricity that we just talked about. You got red blood cells, which don't actually have any organelles, believe it or not. They did at one point, but then they actually throw up their organelles. They spit them out, they eject them from their body. And that allows them to have more space to carry oxygen, and why we use red blood cells to carry oxygen around the body. All kinds of different cells and different unique shapes and different unique functions. So we're going to be looking at a lot of them throughout the rest of this course. But here you can see there's a neuron, there's a skin cell. They're long and flat but stretchy. There's muscle cells right there. They have proteins that allow them to contract and relax. Red blood cells for carrying oxygen. There's like a sperm cell with a big long flagellum that allows it to torpedo and carry information from one place to another. So I got one more video to show you today that is going to kind of go through all of those cells. And so this is going to kind of break down how these animal cells actually work. Hey, good.
Getting an LLC for your business doesn't have to look like this. Just Google LLC Taylor Brands. It's totally easy. You pick
amazing and super. This is an animal. And this is also an animal. An animal, animal, animal carcass, animal, animal, animal carcass, again, animal. The thing that all of these other things have in common is that they're made out of the same basic building block, the animal cell. Animals are made up of your run-of-the-mill eukaryotic cells, and these are called eukaryotic because they have a true kernel in the Greek, a good nucleus, and that contains the DNA and calls the shots for the rest of the cell, also containing a bunch of organelles. There's a bunch of different kinds of organelles, and they all have very specific functions, and all of this is surrounded by the cell membrane. Of course, plants are eukaryotic cells too, but they're set up a little bit differently. Of course, they have organelles that allow them to make their own food, which is super nice. We don't have those. And also, their cell membrane is actually a cell wall. It's made of cellulose. It's rigid, which is why plants can't dance. If you want to know all about plant cells, we did a whole video on it. And you could click on it here. If it's online yet, it might not be. But a lot of the stuff in this video is going to apply to all eukaryotic cells, which includes plants and fungi and protists. Now, rigid cell walls, that's cool and all, but one of the reasons that animals have been so successful is that their flexible membrane, in addition to allowing them the ability to dance, gives animals the flexibility to create a bunch of different cell types and organ types and tissue types that could never be possible in a plant. The cell walls that protect plants and give them structure prevent them from evolving complicated nerve structures and muscle cells that allow animals to be such a powerful force for, eating plants. Animals can move around, find shelter and food, find things to mate with, all that good stuff. In fact, the ability to move oneself around using specialized muscle tissue has been 100% trademarked by Kingdom Animalia.
What about protozoans?
Excellent point. What about protozoans? They don't have specialized muscle tissue. They move around with cilia and flagella and that kind of thing. So way back in 1665, British scientist Robert Hooke discovered cells with his kind of crude beta version microscope. He called them cells because they looked like bare Spartan monks' bedrooms with not much going on inside. Hooke was a smart guy and everything, but he could not have been more wrong about what was going on inside of a cell. There is a whole lot going on inside of a eukaryotic cell. It's more like a city than a monk's cell. In fact, let's go with that. A cell is like a city. It has defined geographical limits, a ruling government, power plants, roads, waste treatment plants, a police force, industry, all the things a booming metropolis needs to run smoothly. But this city does not have one of those hippie governments where everybody votes on stuff and talks things out at town hall meetings and crap like that. Nope. Think fascist Italy circa 1938. Think Kim Jong-un's North Korea, and you might be getting a closer idea of how eukaryotic cells do their business. Let's start out with city limits. So as you approach the city of Eukaryopolis, there's a chance that you will notice something that a traditional city never has, which is either cilia or flagella. Some eukaryotic cells have either one or the other of these structures, cilia being a bunch of tiny little arms that wiggle around, and flagella being one long whip-like tail. Some cells have neither. Sperm cells, for instance, have flagella and our lungs, and throat cells have cilia that push mucus up and out of our lungs. Cilia and flagella are made out of long protein fibers called microtubules, and they both have the same basic structure. 9 pairs of microtubules forming a ring around 2 central microtubules. This is often called the 9+2 structure. Anyway, that's just so you know, when you're approaching the city, watch out for the cilia and flagella. If you make it past the cilia, you will encounter what is called a cell membrane, which is a kind of squishy, not rigid plant cell wall, which totally encloses the city and all of its contents. It's also in charge of monitoring what comes in and out of the cell, kind of like the fascist border police. The cell membrane has selective permeability, meaning that it can choose what molecules come in and out of the cells for the most part. And I did an entire video on this, which you can check out right here. Now, the landscape of Eukaryopolis, important to note, is kind of wet and squishy. It's a bit of a swampland. Each eukaryotic cell is filled with a solution of water and nutrients called cytoplasm. And inside of this cytoplasm is a scaffolding called the cytoskeleton. It's basically just a bunch of protein strands that reinforce the cell. Centrosomes are a special part of this reinforcement. They assemble long microtubules out of proteins that act like steel girders that hold all the city's buildings together. The cytoplasm provides the infrastructure necessary for all the organelles to do all of their awesome, amazing business, with the notable exception of the nucleus, which has its own kind of cytoplasm called the nucleoplasm, which is a more luxurious, premium environment befitting the cell's beloved leader. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about the cell's highway system. The endoplasmic reticulum, or just ER, are organelles that create a network of membranes that carry stuff around the cell. These membranes are phospholipid bilayers, same as in the cell membrane. There are 2 types of ER. There's the rough and the smooth. Fairly similar, but slightly different shapes, slightly different functions. The rough ER looks all bumpy because it has ribosomes attached to it, and the smooth ER doesn't, so it's a smooth network of tubes. Smooth ER acts as a kind of factory warehouse in the cell city. It contains enzymes that help with the creation of important lipids, which you'll recall from our talk about biological molecules. Phospholipids and steroids that turn out to be sex hormones. Other enzymes in the smooth ER specialize in detoxifying substance, like noxious stuff derived from drugs and alcohol, which they do by adding a carboxyl group to them, making them soluble in water. Finally, the smooth ER also stores ions in solutions that the cell may need later on, especially sodium ions, which are used for energy in muscle cells. So the smooth ER helps make lipids, while the rough ER helps in the synthesis and packaging of proteins. And those proteins are created by another type of organelle, the ribosome. Ribosomes can float freely throughout the cytoplasm or be attached to the nuclear envelope, which is where they're spat out from. And their job is to assemble amino acids into polypeptides. As the ribosome builds an amino acid chain, the chain is pushed into the ER. When the protein chain is complete, the ER pinches it off and sends it to the Golgi apparatus. And the city that is the cell, the Golgi, is the post office, processing proteins and packaging them up before sending them wherever they need to go. Calling it an apparatus makes it sound like a bit of complicated machinery, which it kind of is, because it's made up of like these stacks of membranous layers that are sometimes called Golgi bodies. The Golgi bodies can cut up large proteins into smaller hormones and can combine proteins with carbohydrates to make various molecules, like for instance, snot. The bodies package these little goodies into sacs called vesicles, which have phospholipid walls just like the main cell membrane, then ship them out either to other parts of the cell or outside the cell wall. We learn more about how vesicles do this in the next episode of Crash Course.
The Golgi bodies also put the finishing touches on the lysosomes. Lysosomes are basically the waste treatment plants and recycling centers of the city. city. These organelles are basically sacks full of enzymes that break down cellular waste and debris from outside of the cell and turn it into simple compounds which are transferred into the cytoplasm as new cell-building materials.
Now, finally, let us talk about the nucleus, the beloved leader. The nucleus is a highly specialized organelle that lives in its own double-membraned, high-security compound with its buddy, the nucleolus. And within the cell, the nucleus is in charge in a major way. Because it stores the cell's DNA, it has all the information the cell needs to do its job. So the nucleus makes all the laws for the city and orders all the other organelles around, telling them how and when to grow, what to metabolize, what proteins to synthesize, how and when to divide. The nucleus does all this by using the information blueprinted in its DNA to build proteins that will facilitate a specific job getting done. For instance, on January 1st, 2012, let's say a liver cell needs to help break down an entire bottle of champagne. The nucleus in that liver cell would start telling the cell to make alcohol dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that makes alcohol not alcohol anymore. This protein synthesis business is complicated. Lucky for you, we will have, or may already have, an entire video about how it happens. The nucleus holds its precious DNA along with some proteins in a web-like substance called a chromatin. When it comes time for the cell to split, the chromatin gathers into rod-shaped chromosomes, each of which holds DNA molecules. Different species of animals have different numbers of chromosomes. We humans have 46, fruit flies have 8. Hedgehogs, which are adorable, but less complex than humans, have 90. Now the nucleolus, which lives inside of the nucleus, is the only organelle not enveloped by its own membrane. It's just a gooey splotch of stuff within the nucleus. Its main job is creating ribosomal RNA, or rRNA, which it then combines with some proteins to form the basic units of ribosomes. Once these units are done, the nucleolus spits them out of the nuclear envelope where they are fully assembled into ribosomes. The nucleus then sends orders in the form of messenger RNA, or mRNA, to those ribosomes, which are the henchmen that carry out the orders in the rest of the cell. How exactly the ribosomes do this is immensely complex and awesome. So awesome, in fact, that we're going to give it the full crash course treatment, an entire episode. And now for what is, totally objectively speaking, of course, the coolest part of the animal cell. Its power plants, the mitochondria, the smooth, oblong organelles where the amazing and super important process of respiration takes place. This is where energy is derived from carbohydrates, fats, and other fuels and is converted into adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is like the main currency that drives life in Eukaryopolis. You can learn more about ATP and respiration in an episode that we did on that. Now, of course, some cells, like muscle cells or neuron cells, need a lot more power than the average cell in the body, and so those cells have a lot more mitochondria per cell. But maybe the coolest thing about mitochondria is that long ago, animal cells didn't have them, but they existed as their own sort of bacterial cell. And one day, one of these things ended up inside of an animal cell, probably because the animal cell was trying to eat it. But instead of eating it, it realized that this thing was really super smart and good at turning food into energy, and it just kept it. It stayed around. And to this day, they sort of act like their own separate organisms, like they do their own thing within the cell, they replicate themselves, they even contain a small amount of DNA. Now, what may be even more awesome, if that's possible, is that mitochondria are in the egg cell when an egg gets fertilized. And those mitochondria have DNA. But because mitochondria replicate themselves in a separate fashion, it doesn't get mixed with the DNA of the father. It's just the mother's mitochondrial DNA. That means that your and my mitochondrial DNA is exactly the same as the mitochondrial DNA of our mothers. And because this special DNA is isolated in this way, scientists can actually track back and back and back and back to a single mitochondrial Eve who lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. All of that complication and mystery and beauty in one of the cells of your body. It's complicated, yes, but worth understanding. Review time! Another somewhat complicated episode of Crash Course Biology. If you want to go back and watch any of the stuff that we talked about it to reinforce it in your brain, if you didn't quite get it, just click on the links and it'll take you back in time to when I was talking about that mere minutes ago. Thank you for watching. If you have questions for us, please ask below in the comments or on Twitter or on Facebook, and we will do our best to make things more clear for you. We'll see you next time.
Okay. So a lot of pieces in a cell. A lot of pieces. So when we're talking about like a cell doing something, right? A lot of times what we're talking about is like moving materials from one place, from one side of the cell to the other. So we have to talk about this selectively permeable thing, right? The ability, you know, just like we saw here, we were able to selectively choose to move calcium or sodium to one outside the cell, and potassium or no, sorry, the other way around. We chose to move sodium from outside the cell into the cell, and we chose to move you know, stuff from inside the cell outside the cell. So that idea, that process of moving something from one place to another, is what we refer to as diffusion. Okay, so diffusion is where a solute, usually, you know, best example is probably salt. And so this solute travels across a membrane, and it will always move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So it will move down its concentration gradient, right? So something will move from an area where there's a lot of it, like this chunk of salt here, and then it will move away until it's evenly sort of distributed around. This is actually how putting sugar in your coffee works. This is how basically materials simply diffuse from one place to another, right? So diffusion is where, like, imagine if, you know, we were to walk as a group into a big crowd. And it was just like, you know, somebody in our group is just like, look, I hate big crowds. And we just sort of naturally that person just sort of naturally moved where there's the lowest concentration of people. That is kind of an example of diffusion. Diffusion, passive diffusion is what we sometimes refer to it as. Passive diffusion is where something moves from an area of high concentration, thank you, to an area of low concentration. That always happens. Nature, like I said, form follows function. Thank you very much. Thank you. Form follows function. It's a good rule to remember about the universe. Another good rule to remember about the universe: nature hates a gradient, right? If there is just a whole bunch of stuff over here and very little stuff over here, nature will naturally try to move half of this stuff from one side to the other until the concentration on one side is equal to the concentration on the other. That's the simplest way to sort of understand diffusion. Nature will always move from high concentration to low concentration. Now, there are ways to sort of work against nature. For instance, we can use proteins to pump stuff from one side to the other. For instance, moving sodium like this over here and potassium like this over here, that actually took a little bit of energy in order to make that happen. And so that is what's known as facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is actually where we purposefully move something from one place to the other. It takes a little bit of energy in order to make that happen because it's kind of going against the direction that nature wants stuff to move. And then we have osmosis, which is where water moves from one place to another. So, you know, it's actually sort of the reverse of this, right? Like this is where, you know, something broke apart to move to the empty space. Well, another thing that can happen is sometimes like water can rush into a place to push the molecules apart. That also doesn't take any energy. When you consume fluids, for instance, and you are a little dehydrated, your body will go, oh, well, I need some water over here. And water will rush into those spaces to rehydrate you. And then there's also filtration. Filtration is where you actually use some type of mechanical force to push something. And then, you know, the small stuff gets through the holes and the big stuff stays behind. That's actually how your water filter works. So there's simple diffusion. There's facilitated diffusion. You can see these little proteins here are actually like, it opens up, grabs a molecule, and then opens up on the inside. So it's actually pushing against the concentration gradient. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff here and very little stuff here. So it actually naturally does want to move this way, but it can actually pump it against the concentration if it wanted to. Here's osmosis. There's actually, this is kind of a fun one. Actually, if we look at, I wonder if I could find a really quick video of this. Osmosis, salt, water. Well, there we go.
Chasing that A and want to.
So this is kind of fun. It's an animation, but you can actually see this happen in real life as well. So you can see here, this is salt water on one side, and this is regular water on the other. And you'll notice that the water levels are the same. But here's the thing, because this is salt water, the water levels are not the same. Some of the space over here is being taken over by little particles. So what's going to naturally happen, at least I assume so, I think I pulled up the right video. What's going to naturally happen is water is actually going to rush through this membrane. This is a selectively permeable membrane. It'll actually move into this side over here. And it is salt molecules. So there's salt over here. And now water naturally moves from one side over here to over here. This is actually why salt water dehydrates you, is because your cells are mostly water and salt water is not. So then your cells actually push their water out of themselves in order to push all of the salt water apart. And so it looks very different now, but you can see this is actually where there is an equal amount of water on both sides of this membrane. It doesn't look like there's an equal part of water, but remember, a whole bunch of this space is being taken up by salt. That's osmosis, okay? So we see there's a whole bunch of stuff over here and very little stuff over here. Water will actually naturally move itself this way. It's just like diffusion, except with water. And then there's filtration, which is like if you pushed, you could push it back the other way. So generally, the way osmosis works is if there's a very low solute, high water situation, osmosis will actually move that water across a membrane into the high solute, low water space. So when we're referring to whether or not water is going to move from point A to point B, we're going to refer to that as whether or not a fluid is hypertonic, hypotonic, or isotonic. So hyper means lots of, hypo means little of, and iso means equal to. So hypertonic is something that has a really high concentration. So salt water has a really high concentration of salt. So water is naturally going to move towards the salt. That's why, coffee, soda, which has lots of sugar in it, dehydrates us, whereas like pure water doesn't. The more solutes, the more particles of something there is in a fluid, the less hydrating it is. In fact, it can go so far as to actually dehydrate us. Hypotonic solutions are where solutions have a much lower concentration. So fresh water is hypotonic. So generally, if we consume too much water, that can actually make us sick because our cells actually have little particles within them. I mean, look at all the little organelles that are found inside of our cells, right? Red blood cells, for instance, have iron at their center. So when that happens, water rushes into our red blood cells. If you drink too much water, you can actually suffer from what's called hyponatremia, where your red blood cells actually start getting inflated and they can't function very well. And it can thin out your blood, making it hard for you to deliver oxygen. And so you can get drunk on water, and it's extremely, extremely dangerous. However, it's also really hard to do. You got to drink like 2 gallons of water in like a very short period of time. But if you drink salt water, the concentration of salt is so high on the outside and the concentration of stuff on the inside of the cells is so much lower that all the water actually moves out of your cell to push all those salt particles apart. And that shrinks your cell. That's called crenation. And that leaves your cell dehydrated and also doesn't function very well. Whereas like isotonic, drinking just the right amount of water every day, about a gallon on average for men, or about 3/4 of a gallon per day for women, allows your cells to function pretty optimally. So that would be isotonic. And that's why we want to drink fresh water, not salt water. Now, there are other ways to get stuff to move from one place to another in a cell. You've got what is known as active transport. That's actually where something will carry something from one side of the cell to the other. There is also endocytosis, which is an example here where like a particle comes in, the cell membrane closes around it, and then you've got like a little vesicle which will carry it to wherever it needs to go. You get exocytosis, which is exactly the opposite. That's actually where, waste materials will work their way to the edge of the membrane, and the membrane will unfold itself to spit out those materials. And that's how various materials are going to get through your cells. So tomorrow, we're going to start breaking down muscle cells and skeletal cells. And we're going to be talking about like how your muscle cells are moving materials from one place to another in order to create contractions. And so hopefully today gave you a pretty good idea of understanding how like a cell operates in general, and that'll make it a lot easier for us to understand tomorrow's information. But other than that, that is the end of your second lesson today in the youth mod. So we've got homework number 1 going out today. So please, everybody, find your way over to Canvas and knock that out. It is going to cover chapters 1 through 3 of the Memler's textbook, because we actually did 2 chapters today. We did 1 yesterday. So if you want to review PowerPoints 1 and 2, or review the notes from days 1 and day 2, that is obviously going to help with that homework. And like I said, if you're not happy with your score, you can always take it as many times as you want. But other than that, we'll go ahead and kill the recording.